Hello there, my Attachment Theory in Action podcast listeners and viewers. I'm your host, Jenna Kelly, and I hope this conversation finds you well and secure wherever you are listening today. I'm really excited to share this next conversation with you where I get to sit down with Sarah-Bess Dworin, who has been an amazing resource and partner to me and my work with on more of a team and organizational level, as she has helped me to really integrate restorative justice principles and practices more into our work, which has everything to do with attachment because it's rupture and repair. And we're often not very good at the repair part if we're being real. So let me tell you more about Sarah-Bess, and it'll make sense why she does what she does. She is a lifelong learner and educator. She believes in authentic relationships as the foundation of all meaningful learning. She's passionate about supporting schools to build community, engage in productive collaboration, and resolve conflict constructively. Through skillful facilitation, she employs professional learning for staff, coaching of individuals and teams, and modeling of social and emotional learning practices. So you can connect with her on her LinkedIn page, which we will link in the show notes. She's also going to show these really fun dolls that she uses in some of her work with younger children. So we'll link those dolls as well. And you'll want to check this interview out on our YouTube channel so you can see the dolls. She's also going to talk about circle work as a restorative practice and how you can learn more about circle work. We'll link some resources to circle work as well. But she's going to talk about the practical applications, the things that she's doing in her work. Oftentimes, restorative justice gets associated with the criminal justice system, and there's a lot going on in the criminal justice system as well. But Sarah-Bess's work is more focused on working with schools, families, and organizations. So you're going to hear us talk about it in that context. And I know you're going to learn a lot. So sit back and enjoy. Hi, Sarah-Bess. I am so excited to be joining you in conversation today.
Same, me too. Thank you so much for inviting me into this
Yeah,
conversation.
I knew I wanted to have you on the podcast at some point because I have learned so much from working with you. You've been a really resourceful tool in our work as an organization and also interpersonally when we've had some ruptures, and you've really helped us think about how do we repair things in a more intentional way. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today is the work of restorative justice and the work that you've been doing around this. And it has everything to do with attachment. And speaking of attachment, I want to bring more of you into our interview first and invite you to please share an attachment memory that feels important to you and to your work.
Mhm. Well, first, let me just say I ditto in terms of learning. I feel like this work is at its deepest part deeply reciprocal, and I've learned so much from you and from your team, and have gained so many skills and awarenesses that I never would have had we not crossed paths. So I'm very grateful, and I'm excited to talk about these important topics of restorative practices and attachment. And for me, though I combed through my mental annals for childhood memories, what feels most salient to me in the work is a memory of an experience that I had as an emerging adult, which is, I think, when a lot of my ideas about what I wanted to do with my life crystallized. And it happened on a fellowship experience during college, during my last summer of college, and it took place in a retreat center called Corrymeela, which is in Northern Ireland on the coasts overlooking Scotland. And it was a center that welcomed all, both Protestants and Catholics, young people, elders, folks who were in paramilitary organizations and peace activists. And it was a space that was focused on intergroup dialogue, making peace, and figuring out how to live in a good way. And it was the first time that I had been on my own in this way, that I had been empowered with important tasks things like making tea and hugging people. And I just recall feeling just a vibrating sensation so much that summer of what I came to understand is a truly holistic way of being, of doing this work of making peace and staying peaceful with everything at our disposal. So from art projects and singing and hiking up a waterfall and going by the shore to collect stones and cooking and scrubbing toilets. And I realized that I had so many regular garden variety human gifts that everyone possesses, from genuine kindness and a desire to listen to more specialized skills that I myself could offer. But it was in a setting that drew from every part of me. And I remember feeling there was like my gifts were needed, and that everyone's gifts were needed in that space. And so it was a deeply affirming time in my life where I realized that I wanted to capture that feeling of using every part of myself in my work, and living deep in a deeply authentic way. And I will say, because restorative practices is drawn from the wisdom of the lands and waters, that was a big part of my learning at that time, that being in nature, that working with the wisdom of the waterfall and the shore was deeply integral into my learning experience and the healing process for so many folks who were there. It was especially important to work with young people, some of whom were deeply impacted by the violence of the cities, and to see the way in which they kind of sank down deep into the soil of what was happening, and by the end of the week were really emerging in new and unexpected ways. So that's a memory that I hold on to, that reminds me of that feeling that I'm trying to capture when I do the best work.
What a powerful memory. And it sounds like that experience really got you back to your roots and to the way, those more primitive ancestral ways of being in community with each other. And that the restorative practices and work that you're doing is really trying to get back in touch with that because it's in us. I've heard you talk about that. Like it's in our bones, it's in our DNA, the way we used to be together in community. And when we can get back to that, we can work things out. We can have these meaningful opportunities to be in conversation and in healing when that's needed too. So wow, no wonder you're doing all this amazing work. So to keep building on that, tell us more about how do you define restorative justice principles and practices and in the work that you're doing?
Mm, thank you for that. I will say that um, more than anything, it is tapping into wisdom traditions. Certainly not primitive, but ancient, and deeply grounding. Um, and writ large, if I had to give a bumper sticker for what this work is about, it's living together in a good way. And that can certainly mean different things to different people. So I'll further refine this idea of living in a good way, meaning um, living in such a way that honors the dignity of every human being and our non-human creatures and the land and waters, and yeah, and enjoying that life and that harmony. And then when harmony is inevitably disrupted, either through misunderstanding, miscommunication, conflict, or harm, uh, moving toward an encounter with that individual or with those individuals in order to seek an opportunity to move back into a good way, and to address that rupture rather than ignoring it, rather than pretending it hasn't happened, or gaslighting that person. So the work has, like, so much good work, both proactive and responsive qualities to it. And I think the proactive is the very most important. I think, as you and your listeners likely believe, it's those healthy attachments that do a world more than any kind of responsive work could do, and that our core work as restorative practitioners is building deeply authentic relationships that allow individuals to belong in authentic ways to community. And in ancient societies, it would have been a different process of belonging. One belonged to one's immediate village or community or tribe, one that was likely not a multiracial or multi-ethnic community, although certainly I'm sure there are many exceptions to that. And so in this American society, we have this incredible opportunity and also challenge of uncovering what does it mean for people who are vastly different from one another to truly belong together. And then the final thing I will say about living in a good way is when we live in a good way, we are deeply conscious of the reality that we are all connected and that everyone is necessary for the wisdom that they bring, whether it is to do the work of living and life or whether it's to do the work of repair. And when we live in a way that honors the reality, not the aspiration, but the truth that every single person is deeply connected, both in a web of relationships and in an unseen web of connections that is felt deeply in our spirits. When we live in that way, we can live in a good way with each other. We can live in harmony. And when we've harmed someone or when we've wronged someone or when that has happened to us, we have the deep imperative to come back to that person, to come back to that relationship because it's good. And because we presume that that person did not have malicious intent. And that can be so difficult to develop that kind of trust in community. But when I have that sense that this person in front of me is deeply connected and necessary to my existence, I interact with them in a different quality.
Yeah. And in my work with you, Sarah-Bess, it's been such a privilege to see the way you truly and genuinely exude these characteristics. Because as I hear you explain this, and some of our listeners might be saying, this sounds like a fairy tale or, this ideal way of being. And I think you're an example of how it can start with us, in the way that we show up. And you were talking about like using all of the parts of yourself. And when you hold space in that way, things can shift, magic can happen. And it's not always a fairy tale. We know that, but it's it's so powerful when we do some of the work on ourselves first, so then we can bring that into the work that we're doing. So I'm wondering, because you talked about, both the proactive and responsive pieces of the work, but how did you what's some of the work you've had to do to really be able to show up in your work in this way, in holding space and helping organizations and schools and families, do both those proactive and responsive pieces?
Yeah, for me, and I'll pick up on that idea that you left in your summary, which is that this idea of this magic. Certainly, I want to disabuse everyone. Like I do not have a magic wand for any of this work, and no pixie dust in my pocket. But what I think the magic is that you're describing is this ever elusive feeling and actuality of accountability. And that I was perhaps remiss in including that in my definition of restorative practices, because for me, that's the point. And I can illustrate this idea of proactive and responsiveness with this notion of accountability. And I think first I need to say that often accountability to us in our culture, we're socialized to believe that to be accountable means to be punished.
Mhm.
And to be accountable means to be held accountable by someone else in a position of authority over us. And that's not what I mean. What I mean is a sense of shared accountability, and it comes from this reality that we are all connected and we are all needed in order to make this community thing work. And so, on a proactive in a proactive way, we can begin to develop shared accountability in communities, in groups, in teams, in families by talking about what we expect with each when we show up with each other and for each other. And some communities call these norms, some call them shared agreements, but they are ways that we explicitly articulate our expectations of each other. And I find that if we don't do that, we never know. If we don't ask, what do you need in order to show up as your authentic self, we'll never be able to offer it to them. And so it is an uncomfortable process sometimes of creating these shared agreements. And often teams that work together need to create both procedural agreements and relational agreements in order to be as explicit as possible to name what they expect of each other. Um, and so this is, I think, the foundation of every restorative community, and the way in which we can lay the groundwork for what inevitably happens when one of those agreements is transgressed. I often really want to emphasize that word when, not if. Folks think typically that harm is an anomaly, or and I think that's because it feels surprising when it happens to us. But the truth is that harm is the most ubiquitous element to our human experience. And we really struggle to kind of interact with that reality and to respond to that reality. But when it happens, we can use those shared agreements to call ourselves back to the way that we named that we wanted to show up. And we can even just say that we agreed to X. In this moment, that would look like Y. Can we get back to that good way? And it can be done in ways that are true to an individual's own voice. Obviously, that won't work for everyone. And so this is really a deeply personalized approach as well. Um, and when we can call ourselves back to our agreements, we are really doing the hard work of shared accountability. It's not someone who is in a position of hierarchical power who is going to say, you didn't do this. Why didn't you do this? You're bad. You have malintent. Stop it. And here's your punishment. And let's get back to it. That will yield no kinds of good results, and certainly not contribute to an experience of living in harmony. And so it really is shared accountability, because everyone in that community, in that team, in that family is responsible for taking leadership in moments of rupture. And there's
Yeah.
a lot more to say about other practices that we can use when that rupture happens. But for me, that accountability is the pivot point of proactive and responsive work.
Yeah, and I think shared agreements can be both proactive and responsive, like you described. And you were so helpful. We have a large team of early childhood mental health consultants, and we needed to establish those shared agreements so that we
Mm-hmm.
could truly be in community with each other and have difficult conversations around whether it's race or social justice or our work, or, which is part of the work, of course, but
Yeah.
it gives us that foundation to have a way of being with each other, have that roadmap. So can you share a little bit more, since shared agreements is a practice, how you use those? Because it's my understanding you can use those from a micro to a macro level, maybe even thinking about how would you use that within a family, within an organization, within a community. So can you share more about that?
Mm-hmm. I think shared agreements, as you say, can be deeply situational. And so it is at its core simply asking each individual, what do you need in this place to show up in the way that we all that you want to show up as your authentic self. And with that is baked in psychological safety. I think that is always the feeling to which we aspire when we create shared agreements. We want each person to know deeply in their bones that they belong here, and that they're the fullness of their identity, the fullness of their self, like that feeling that I had when I was a young person in the retreat center. That fullness gets to show up every time, and that does feel deeply aspirational, especially in a multiracial society where racial harm happens on a daily, moment to moment basis. Um, and so I think because shared agreements are so situational, we have to get really creative and imaginative about what will speak to the folks in the room. In classrooms, that can look like actually writing them out on a large post-it, and not just letting that sit there and collect dust, but regularly coming back to them, flexing that shared agreement muscle, and even revising them when the situation merits. So, in a classroom, perhaps a teacher has set shared agreements with their class using a circle practice, if they're familiar with that. And if they're not, maybe it looks like writing a constitution for a social studies class. Maybe it looks like creating an equation if it's a math class. So there are deeply personalized ways to speak in the language of the group, if that helps. I'm not sure if I answered your
Yeah,
question in its
that's
entirety.
very, very helpful. And I love how you can, like you said, personalize it and individualize it to whatever the group is needing and how it's going to help that land, but that we can build this in and that it's important. And then, like you said, it's not just something we set to the side, okay, we did this. It's really not only what are we identifying and naming it, but how are we operationalizing it and utilizing it in our everyday interactions and learning environment.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned circle work, so I want to come back to that as well. But
Sure.
since you shared an example of a school, I want you to touch more on some of the things that schools can do both in a proactive and responsive way. And I know you've helped a lot of schools do incorporate more of these restorative practices into them. And so what does that look like? What does that feel like?
Mm. It feels joyful and also really hard. And I think one of the things that's changed about the way that I do that work over the past several years is really naming it as a culture change. Because I think we have to name what we are moving away from in order to really have these ways of being and doing come into high relief. And because schools are so habituated to buying programs and curricula and rolling in something new, um, we have to do this differently, because restorative practices or restorative justice in education is not a program, it's a worldview. It's a way of thinking and being and doing. And we have certain practices and skill sets to help us live out that mindset. So I think the first thing that schools can do is articulate that a change is going to come, and that can feel really scary to everyone in the organization, because organizations are designed to perpetuate the status quo. And there may be folks in the organization that don't understand why a change is necessary. And so that's an important piece of the first step, is articulating the case for change. And schools can do that in all kinds of ways. Data is certainly a very important one, whether it's disciplinary data, thinking about the frequency of their exclusions, whether it's small, subtle exclusions from the classroom or big exclusions that create a deep sense of unbelonging or othering in students who are suspended or expelled. And it can also be data on academic achievement and student engagement in classes. And so there are so many ways to tell the story of why we need to make a change. And certainly anecdotals are really important. People who experience going to work and have to shove a part of themselves deep below know that there could be some other way. People who are unhappy or feel unsafe when they come to work, we need to appeal to their self-interest and express to them in no uncertain terms that this culture change process is a process by which they will gain more happiness, more safety, and greater equity within the system. And so that first piece is critical, and helping leaders to be aware of what it takes to lead a culture change process is critical in organizations that are by and large hierarchical. Those leaders got to lead, and then everything follows from there, and it's certainly a long process, and I think that it typically takes 3 to 5 years for an organization that is embarking on a culture change process in a very earnest way to begin to see the fruits of their labor, although there are early victories that are very satisfying.
Yeah, cultural change is very difficult. So I love that you named the 3 to 5 years. And in a culture where we want quick, fast results, that can be hard. And like you said, there can be these quicker victories as you go down this continuum and this journey. But we also have to be realistic that we are, changing mindsets. It's a big paradigm shift. And yet when schools or organizations invest in these more restorative practices, there's like this palpable difference between, being focused on punishment versus being focused on true restorative practices and how do we heal, because that's where true learning can happen,
Mm-hmm.
is when we're able to truly heal and hear about another person's experience or hear about when there has been potential harm. And circle work, I know, is one of the ways that can help this these principles. So can you share more about circle work? I know it's been a really powerful process for our organization and our team.
Absolutely. Yes, when folks think of restorative practices, often they do imagine everyone sitting in a circle. So if that's kind of the image that you have in your mind, you're not far off.
Yeah.
And yeah, and it goes back to this notion of learning from the wisdom of the land and the waters. And so it's a fun kind of scavenger hunt experience to go out into the world and notice all of the things that grow in circles, from the trees to eggs, I mean, circles, broadly speaking, or to nests, and the ways in which our non-human friends can teach us what it is to come together in a good way and to create a space of resilience. And so I think circles are that thing for me. I feel that they promote healthy attachment, to use the language of this podcast, in so many different ways. Oh, what to say about circles? I will say that that circles are an ancient and a contemporary way of coming together that is sparked by the original spark. I would say that the flame of of human beings' great discovery of fire, and gathering around a fire, if you've ever had that experience, feels really different from gathering in other kinds of spaces and places and around other kinds of furniture. And fire became an organizing principle of cultures. When ancient peoples gathered around fire for good food, safety, and security, for warmth, then it became a way to organize ceremony and dance and drumming And so I try to hold on to this ancient way whenever I sit in a contemporary circle, and it might be in a skyscraper where I don't feel as connected to the land, but that feeling still shows up. And in circle, there are so many ways to circle, and I am so grateful for all of the teachers that I've had, all the elders that I've had, who have explained to me um, ways of being in the circle and actions to do in the circle, and ways to center myself. Both my elders in my own family and Indigenous circle practitioners and Indigenous elders who are showing so many people the way of coming together. Um, and it's traditional to have a centerpiece, an object of meaning and beauty to look at in the middle of the circle. It also disrupts our need to stare at each other in the eye. So it's a culturally responsive approach, certainly also good for neurodivergent young people to be able to look at a centerpiece instead of at a person's face. Circles are also characterized by talking pieces that is another object of beauty and meaning that gets passed around the circle and invites people to speak, but doesn't expect people to speak. So circle tradition has always honored that silence is just as valuable as speech. And there's no forced sharing in a circle. A circle is not a coercive space. It's a voluntary space. And that's really critical to circle conversations. And there are many different circle traditions that have different roles in the circle of leadership that shows up. I would say, in vocabulary, others might recognize like servant leadership. So it's not coercive or hierarchical leadership, but it's leadership that is offering gifts to the group, and then other people take leadership during other circles. So it's rotating. And Circle can be used for both proactive community building purposes and responsive purposes. I have here with me some dolls that I use in circles with young people, with little people, I should say. They are beautiful teaching tools that can also be used as talking pieces. This is Hugtopus,
Ah,
and this is Love Bug, and there are others. Love Bug is is a bug, but also can transform into a creature with wings. And so there are so many metaphors that are exciting to use with these creatures to teach social and emotional competencies. There are little feelings pillows. This, by the way, is called Kimochis. And it's a wonderful resource that I was excited to learn in a previous job from a mentor whose friend actually created this system, and they are a little feelings pillows that get put inside the little pouches of the creatures. And so in circle, we can talk about our feelings. We can talk about our own feelings and our own experiences, but we can also talk about the feelings of others. And for young people, that looks like the feelings of dolls or sometimes other children in the circle. So much can happen in circle space that I don't even have enough time in the day to talk about all the possibilities of circle, but those are just a few.
I love the dolls. So our listeners will have to check out our YouTube channel to see them, and we can link. I know there's a lot of great resources on circle work and
Absolutely. And certainly circle for families.
circle for families and the dolls. If you have a link for those, we can put those in the show notes too.
Yeah.
And I think, like, I joked about, we're all sitting around singing Kumbaya, but in a way, it's moving the furniture out of the way, move the desks out of the way, move the tables out of the way, and coming together in a way where everyone has a chance to truly be seen and heard and valued is so powerful. And there's, like you said, different things that you can do within those circles, whether it's more proactive or responsive. But I've experienced the power of circle work firsthand in both contexts, both proactively and responsively. And it's
Mm-hmm.
amazing what can happen when just introducing like a talking piece, like you said. as a way to add that structure and give individuals a chance to share if they want to share or to pass if they want to pass, taking out that
Mhm.
hierarchy. Um, so it's truly a practice that I think is trauma informed. You know, that's a word that we
Mhm.
hear so much, but it's like, what are we doing to really practice being trauma informed? And I think
Mhm.
circle is a way to do that.
Absolutely, I think so. And it's also true for me that though, it might sound like a space where, children frolic with kittens and rainbows, it doesn't always feel good to be in circle. Especially responsive circles are really hard. And there's a lot of intense emotional energy in that space. And in responsive circles, it's a space for accountability, to name and to own what is ours to accept. And so it doesn't. It's not always lovely, but it's really valuable and it's really meaningful, and it I think creates more resilient families, workplaces, communities, because we do the hard work that needs to be done in all of our other spaces and places. But circle is a place to practice and to incubate that. I almost think about it like a nest. And it is trauma informed, to your point. And it helps us to learn what it is to be in a space where someone is holding us accountable in a non-coercive, non-violent way. And so it can be an unlearning space as well for trauma impacted individuals.
Yeah, can you share more about circles that are responsive in nature and maybe some of the things that you would do in a circle that is working on repairing?
In a repair process, it is a highly iterative process, but I'll sort of outline the steps that we need to take in order to bring people together. So much has to happen before we can get folks in that room, in that circle. Um, and the most important step are pre-conferences, which I call restorative conversations. Some folks call it porch sitting. It's a way of getting together one on one, ideally knee to knee, eye to eye with another human who is engaged in a miscommunication, a misunderstanding, a conflict, or has experienced or caused harm, and trying to understand what's happened from their perspective, trying to understand how they were feeling at the time that happened, how they're feeling about it now, uh, who they think has been impacted by this occurrence, and what they think they need and the others involved in this might need in order to move forward in a good way. And sometimes that looks like taking specific measures of accountability or to demonstrate accountability. Sometimes that looks like an apology, although never forced, never coerced apologies. And sometimes it's simply having the conversation as opposed to ignoring that thing. Acknowledgement is a core need that folks have in situations of harm and conflict. And so after those one-on-ones, and those are the places where I'm looking to receive consent from folks, to make sure that they want to participate in an encounter process. Because if we think about punitive ways of holding folks accountability, we are separating individuals and sometimes never bringing them back together. But restorative practices is all about the encounter, but it's about the encounter in a way that is centered on the needs of the person who is most impacted or most vulnerable in this situation. It's a tradition that has come about to rally around the needs of the person who's harmed, which is an often, I think, looked over aspect of restorative practices that's different from just offering logical consequences. It's focused on a person's needs. And in that circle space, that person or people get to say what they need in order to move forward in a good way. And it's the obligation of those who have caused harm to meet those needs. So if you talk about it like a trauma informed mindset, it really is addressing unmet needs, which is, we know, a form of trauma. And getting those needs met then becomes the vehicle by which the person who has caused harm becomes reintegrated into that group, whether it's a family, whether it's a working team, or a school classroom. And that reintegration process affirms the dignity of the harm doer as well as being necessary for the success of the group, and the group expressing to that harm doer the quality of interaction that they expect from that person, who deeply belongs. So it's not denigrating anyone. It is really uplifting human dignity.
Yeah, and thinking about attachment and that rupture and repair piece, this is such, it's a framework for that process to happen, not in a way, like
Mm,
you said, that's forced, but that gives the space for some of those difficult conversations. And also it's so important in attachment for people to be able to talk about what's happened to me. That's part of what becomes their more integrated narrative, and to be able to share that in a space like a circle can be a really powerful part of the healing, even if it doesn't lead to forgiveness, which that's something else I wanted to ask you about. So what comes up for you when people are expecting forgiveness, or you know
mm,
that when that's in part of the reparative work, or is it an expectation? What comes up?
so much comes up. And I really resonate with this idea of, I'm glad you named narrative, because these circles are all about storytelling, about telling the stories of one's people, about telling the story of one's life, and that process of meaning making that happens when we speak story into the collective. And sometimes forgiveness is a part of that story, and sometimes it isn't. I often I really appreciate healing centered um, schools that focus on finding ways and avenues or providing opportunities to for students to heal from either prior trauma or the ways that they've been impacted by the school system. Um, but I don't think anyone can certainly ask forgiveness of another person. Um, well, let me redo that. I think forgiveness is really hard for me, Jenna. I think you'll notice. I will say that as a practitioner, I don't enter into a restorative process with the expectation that anyone will forgive anyone else. It can be a byproduct, just as healing can be a byproduct. I think of the process of accountability as primary. I think that some people don't need accountability to offer forgiveness, and they view that forgiveness as a spiritual release that is not contingent on the other person. Uh, and I think that's a very individual perspective. Uh, but many, and I think most, require a measure of accountability in order to be willing to entertain ideas of forgiveness. And so, in situations where young people have harmed each other greatly, my goal is not for them to hug it out at the end. My goal is to interrupt the violence, to squash it. And even if those two young people don't speak to each other again, don't consider themselves friends again, if their conflict, which might have erupted or already did erupt in a violent way, if that's squashed, I consider that process a success. So forgiveness is not an aim, but a lovely byproduct for some.
Yes, I like that byproduct, and reminding us that it's really about that accountability. I think, especially in our culture, more American Western culture, we like to tie things up with a pretty bow and have an outcome. Like the outcome
Mm,
has to be, like you said, we hug it out, there's forgiveness. And one of the other things I've learned in working with you, Sarah-Bess, is that it's the endings, so to speak. I mean, it's ongoing, but
mhm,
if there is an ending, sometimes it's still messy, but that we've created this space where we can, like you said, have accountability and work towards repair in whatever that looks like for those individuals. And it may
Hmm.
not be that beautiful, happy ending.
Absolutely. That's life is imperfect, but it's less imperfect than traditional ways that we have been socialized over the past 150 years to engage with folks in conflict, which clearly is not working for anyone, and as a society at large. So yeah, folks often say, well, that wasn't that satisfying, or I don't really see that this did anything. And I invite them to think about what their lives were like and what their relationship was like before the engagement in a practice. And if it's 15% better, I consider that to be satisfying. If it's better than it was before, that is likely a lot better than something that a traditional, more punitive, or dominating or authoritarian approach might accomplish.
Mm, yeah, it's a different way of being with each other. Like you said, we're conditioned to really not, we use the word conflict avoidant, and that I think that's what our culture
Yes.
values. And there's so many reasons why we might be that way, including our attachment style. But this gives us a different experience, and we need to practice with it. We need that cultural shift. So, on that note, is what do you envision for restorative work in schools, in communities, in families, in the world? What's your vision?
Well, I think I spend a lot of time in what I think of as like a chicken eye view, focusing on the ground, on the immediate relationships that I'm engaged with and I'm tending to, rather than an eagle eye soaring approach, looking at the big picture. So I think that's why it's hard for me to come up with a vision um, of a society as a whole. But I also do know, and wise ones have explained, that culture change, happens when hubs of difference and incubation spaces of new ways or old ways of being and doing link up, rather than necessarily some like widespread um, conversation as a nation, which we are not about to have, certainly not in 2024. Um, what I broadly wish for is for individuals to be able to know in their bones that they belong. Because I think when a person feels a sense of belonging, whether it's in their intimate relationships, whether it's at work, at school, um, there is a cascade effect that's very powerful that I think we maybe experienced long, long ago, and I feel a deep yearning for that type of connection. And that for me, that belonging is deeply reciprocal, where an individual knows that they need their community for everything, for survival. And that community also knows that they need each and every individual to contribute their part, and that no one believes that we would be better off if we just shoved someone to the side. Um, much less, and there are so many kinds of shoving to the side. So I consider myself an abolitionist, and the work of dismantling prison industrial complex is a part of understanding how to create authentic accountability, um, and that shoving aside is also something that we can do in small, subtle ways in our relationships with each other. So I really deeply work for a world where we experience belongingness.
Yeah, and I feel that from you. Like I started with, it you exuded, and so that cascading effect that you're talking about has more of a chance of happening And so I think it's a call to all of us to keep that mindset in mind, so to speak, and that sense of belonging is so imperative
Mm.
to each and every one of us, and we all deserve to belong. So I mentioned how powerful your work's been with us, and there may be listeners that want to learn more about your work. And I know you're humble and you're like, I don't even have a website, and that's okay. But if people want to get a hold of you, where can they find you, and what kind of work are you doing? So they know more about that.
And thank you. You're right. I I don't have a website. I do have a LinkedIn page, and I'm happy to correspond with anyone who would like more resources or who would like to talk about this more. And I work, broadly speaking, in schools and with organizations that serve youth. I also work in community, so very often people I'm connected with will ask for support and guidance, often in the form of holding circle space for folks. And I think that that's such an important part of the way that we can do this authentically outside of institutions. So I have an appetite for that as well. And yeah, just I'm really eager and happy to link up with folks who are who have an appetite for doing business differently, and who can see the possibilities of a shift in mindset and worldview. I also want to offer an invitation, which is that if listeners are excited about this notion of circle, and what circle looks like, I have been very fortunate to begin and then release to the community a regular weekly circle that takes place online. So you can log in from wherever you are in the world. And we have folks from all over the country. And at the beginning, from all over the world. This, you might imagine, was began in the pandemic, and was an opportunity to support people's connection during an apocalyptic moment, and has been sustained for these past 4+ years, in a community of just really wonderful individuals who are practicing that experience of belonging. So if you would like to come to an online circle and meet a lovely group of people who are thinking about these issues as well, please feel free to reach out, and I will extend the invitation. It's open to all. No obligation to show up every week, just when you can. For hosts out there who would like to facilitate an online circle, we welcome you as well.
Wow, what an amazing opportunity. And now I want to come to that too. So,
Yes, please.
well, thank you so much, Sarah-Bess, for sharing your gifts, your knowledge, your wisdom with us. This has been very enlightening, and you are just simply awesome. So thank you for being here.
Back at you. It's reciprocal. Thank you
Take
so
good
much,
care.
Jenna.
I can't wait to continue to learn from you and with each other.